I hope you got a high level idea of what Flask does and how do you create a Flask application, at least the boilerplate code. So far, I have talked about web services, I have talked about web applications, APIs, HTTP, client server architecture, how APIs use client server architecture. I also talked about REST API, and then finally, I talked about or I introduced you to Flask. But I have not shown you APIs in real life. So let's explore or look at some of the websites using which you can see what APIs are and what APIs do. I have a few websites open. The first one is google.co.in, and if you see here, this is the endpoint. Let me zoom it. So this is the google.co.in website, and if I click on, let's say, about, and see, this changes, right? The endpoint changes. If I click on products, again the endpoint would change. The product is now about.google/products/. And if I click on commitments, again the endpoint got changed. It is about.google/commitments. So this is one of the websites that I wanted to talk about. Then let's go to AWS documentation. Now here the actual website is https://docs.aws.amazon.com. Now if I click on, let's say, EC2, it will take me to EC2 website, but as you can see here, the endpoint has changed. Now earlier it was docs.aws.amazon.com. Now it has docs.aws.amazon.com/EC2 with certain variables also. These are called variables. Anyway, we'll talk about variables after the first hands-on. If I go to the user guide, Amazon EC2 user guide, and look at the endpoint, it has changed. AWS EC2/latest/user guide and an HTML page. Now, why am I showing you this? Why am I showing you this, that these are getting changed? So these are basically APIs. Whenever you click on something, the moment I click on this get started button, it is calling an API. So if I click on, let's say, overview on AWS, it will call an API behind the scenes, and the endpoint of that API is this one. Or the resource, the API resource is this one, which is the docs.aws.amazon.com/white papers and followed by some other words. Same is the case with PayPal also, and this is the PayPal home, paypal.com/n/home. Now if I go to, let's say, personal and click on shop with PayPal, you'll see that this endpoint has changed. So the moment I clicked on shop with PayPal, it made a call to the API, and the endpoint of that API is paypal.com/n/webapps/mpp/online shopping. This is the endpoint or the API. So behind the scenes, how the coding is happening. So we have this UI application or user interface application. The moment we click on, let's say, link here, it will call an API behind the scenes. So the clicking of this link is mapped to an API calling, and that's what is happening behind the scenes. So as you can see, the endpoint has changed. Now let's go ahead and look at a website which we typically work on, which is the AWS console. Now I'm using AWS cloud. You can use any cloud that you want. And this is the endpoint, https://us/east1, then the console endpoint, followed by console, then followed by home, and then after question mark we have region equal to US East 1. So what it means is the highlighted portion that I'm showing from here till here. So from HTTPS till home is the API. This is the API endpoint or the API resource or the web service resource. After question mark are the variables or the arguments that you are passing to this API. The key of the argument is, or the variable is, region, and its value is US East 1. So this is the key and this is the value, or this is the variable, this is the, and this is the value. So we are calling this API and we are passing the region variable with the value US East 1. Now if I change it to, let's say, S3, you'll see the endpoint has changed also. Now it is S3/home followed by region US East 1. Now let me open EMR. You'll see that the endpoint would change again. It's /EMR/home and the region is US East 1 and there are certain other values also, which is clusters. From here till here, the entire HTTPS till/home is the API, and whenever you click on something, it passes some value to that API, and then that API actually gets executed. So these are the real life examples of APIs that we see in our surroundings. You can find these APIs anywhere. If you open a online website, you'll see these APIs. If you open an online banking, healthcare, insurance, or anything, you would see these APIs in action. So these are the real life examples of APIs. If I have to map this particular exercise, whatever I have shown you, with the diagram, with the first diagram that I had shown you in the beginning, which is this one, this is the user interface application. And I had shown you this application structure. This UI application are the websites that I have just shown you. And whenever we click a button in the UI application, it makes a call to an API, which is an endpoint or a resource, which is shown in the address page also. It essentially calls a backend application, maybe one or more backend applications. So now what will you do is that in this particular course, we will be creating these applications. We will be creating application 1, we will be creating application 2 without creating the UI application. Because of course, this is not a course on user interface programs like JavaScripts and HTML, but basically how you create APIs and call them. That's what we are going to do. So that's what Flask does. Now in our case, all these backend applications, if we have multiple APIs, we'll be using Flask in all these applications that you see here. It can be a backend application, it can be application 1, application 2, or multiple other applications. We'll be using Flask library. At the end of the course, I'll create a very simple UI application using HTML, and from there I will map a function or API call or with Flask with a particular button. That's what I'm going to do at the end of the course. So I hope you have got a fair amount of idea about what APIs are and how those are used in real life scenarios in our surroundings. Now coming back to the fact of the matter is, how do you implement API using Flask? Because I have shown you Flask, I have shown you Python. You know Python application separately and you know Flask library separately. We installed the Flask library and I had shown you the folders and Python programs which are installed as part of the Flask package installation. Now, how do you glue them together and implement the APIs that I have shown you just now? Like, let's say, PayPal API or State Bank of India API or any other API for that matter. So this is what I have shown you. We import the Flask class from the Flask module or Flask library, and then we instantiate a variable or an object. In this case, the name of the object is app equal to Flask, which is the class, and we pass the argument dunder name dunder. You can use anything other than app, but as a standard practice, in most of the cases, app is used. As I told you earlier, to implement API in Python, we'll have to write a function or a method. So if it is a plain and simple Python program, then it would be a function. If you're writing the function inside of a class, then it would be a method. Now let's say it's a function, and this is how we write the function, right? So define followed by the name of the function and all the programming logic that you put in. Now return is very essential. You cannot write a function without the return statement if you are using it with Flask. Then we execute the program like this. If dunder name dunder equal to main, then app.run followed by something something, which I have not shown you yet. We'll see this in our hands-on shortly. Now this is the endpoint and this is the resource, let's say http:// the IP address of the server or the URL of the server followed by the name of the API, which is get price. Now what I want to do is that I want to make sure that whenever I paste this URL in the web page, it should execute the calculate final price. So I want to map the get price API or this entire API resource with this particular function. Now, how do you do that? We do that using this particular magic keyword. @app, this app is nothing but the object that we instantiated, and then dot route followed by the name of the API, and the name of the API has to be prepended with a forward slash, and it has to be either in single quotes or double quotes. Now the moment we add this magic keyword line or the magic line and start the Flask application and mention the IP address followed by the API name, this function will be executed and it will return order ID and total price. It has to return something. So it will return order ID and total price. So essentially this endpoint or the resource or the API is tied to this function using this magic line, which is @app. App is the object again, which was instantiated, followed by route. Route is a keyword, and then the name of the API in single quote or double quotes, forward slash, and the name of the API. Now, what is this @? I'll talk about @ shortly. This is called a decorator in Python. I'm not going into the details of decorator, but I'll just tell you at a high level what it does. Anyway, this is how we implement APIs using Flask and Python. So this is my Python code, and I started running the Flask application, and then I tied the API with this function definition using the @app.route keyword. By default, it will run on localhost on port number 5000, but it might so happen that port number 5000 will not be available, so we'll have to change the port. And if you want to execute the server IP URL from your local machine, so in your local machine, you can use localhost:5000 followed by the name of the API. In this case, it would be get price. The current exercises that we are going to do would be on our local machine. Once we are done with the local machine, then I'll do the implementation in cloud. This was just one API that I had shown you. In a single Python program, you can implement multiple APIs also. So let's say this is the Python program and I have three different functions. One is list product, the other one is list items, and the other one is get product. What list product does, it reads a file and lists all the records of that file. List items will again read the file, list the number of items per product, and get product will get the product details for the product ID. And these are the endpoints or the resources or the services or the URLs or the APIs, whatever you might want to call it. The first one is slash list product. Now I'm mapping this list product with this definition. So @app.route followed by the name of the API. So the moment we do that, this API is mapped with the function list product. Same is the case with the second one. List items is mapped with the function list items, and get product is mapped with the function get product using this special line. Now you might see that the name of the functions are similar to that of the API names. Again, this is a best practice that you should name the functions and the APIs similar so that there's no confusion. Using this diagram, I'm trying to tell you that you can implement multiple APIs in the same Python program. What you have to do is that you'll need to have multiple functions for those multiple APIs, and then you'll have to add the magic line followed by the name of the API. Let's go ahead and do some hands-on. We'll run a Flask application and then we'll create a very basic API.